And don't worry about that. Once I start talking, he'll go to sleep. As many of you do. So we're into the last sermon in the Faith, Hope, and Love series. This is The Greatest is Love. So we've moved away from definitions, and now we're moving into the comparison language. So if you're going to say that love is the greatest, you have to understand what faith, hope, and love are. And now we're going to spend this time comparing them and trying to understand what is meant by love is the greatest. So we're in 1 Corinthians 13 still, and the verse that I'm referencing we'll be covering today, finally. 1 Corinthians 13:13, and now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. And so we're going to go through chapter 13 and see how that conclusion was drawn. So 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And we're beginning back in verse 1. I know we read this last week, but we can read things multiple times, and that's okay. Verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. So we'll stop right here for just a moment. I had to ask myself, what do all of these things have in common? These things are listed in a particular order, it seems, and so what do they all have in common? And I think that they have two things in common. The first thing that I think they have in common is that they are all some form of expression of faith or faithfulness. You know, looking back through, our faith is a reaction to knowledge that we have. And so fathoming the mysteries of the universe is an exercise in faith, in a way. Being able to speak in tongues and prophesy is something that requires faith. Faith in the correct God, faith in the right things. Faith that can move mountains is probably pretty obvious there. It's probably a reference back to Jesus' teaching about the faith of a mustard seed. If you just have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. So if you have a mountain-moving faith, that's nothing without love. And then the only reason that you might give all that you possess to the poor and hand your body over to hardship, as it says, is that you have faith that will matter eternally somehow, that there's an afterlife, or that there is some kind of eternal reward or consequence for our actions here on the earth. And so everything in this list appears to be a byproduct of faith in some form or another. And I look at what else they have in common. It seems as though these are pretty fantastical things. You know, when you read through them, these are things that we might be impressed by, or dare I say, we would definitely be impressed by. You think about someone speaking in tongues or prophesying, like that's crazy. You know, I don't know what your views are on speaking in tongues or anything like that. That's not the point of the sermon. It happened in the New Testament. That's not an argument. The argument is whether it's still happening now. That's impressive. That would be an impressive thing to witness or to see. Prophecy is an impressive thing to witness or see. Fathoming all mysteries of the universe. We might doubt that the person is actually capable of that, but still that would be an impressive thing to witness or see. And these fantastical gestures of faith and faithfulness amount to nothing without having love. That's the point of this early portion of the text, is trying to establish the importance and primacy of love. Love becomes the most important thing, but because regardless of what else is going on and all these other things, love is the most important one. Love is the most important, and it has to be the guiding principle. And I had to ask myself also, this idea, I'm getting ahead of myself in the sermon. Let me tell you a story. Shift gears. Let me tell you a story about this, because I had a weird experience one time, and I thought it would be worth sharing, and I think it illustrates this point well. When I first got the call to ministry, I was at church camp, rehearsed story, I've told you that many times. That I made some friends at church camp that week, and they invited me to their church one time. And I was like, oh, this is great, I'll get around and see different churches and do different things. And it was some kind of like revival service. It was on a Friday night. It was out in Owasso somewhere. And so I went out to this service. It was at a place I'd never heard of, and a place I'd never heard of. I'd never been to Owasso. And I rolled into the church, and I sat in the back, and then my friends rolled in, because I got there before them, and they rolled in and sat in the back with me, and then the service starts. If people start speaking in tongues, it starts getting a little wild in there. There may or may not have been some running up and down the aisles and some other crazy stuff, and that's okay. And then we got past the worship set, and I was like, okay, good. Like, there's some teaching. I'm going to learn some stuff. This is going to be good. And this guy walks up, and he's like, I forget his name. I'll just say his name was Jimmy or something, John or something. I don't know. He walks up, and he's like, I'm Apostle John. I'm going to be teaching you today. And I was like, whoa, okay, this is different. All right. I've never heard that title ascribed to someone before, but all right. And so he started teaching and went through and taught for a while. So obviously, like, I'm in a different tradition. I'm out of my element here. But there was one thing in particular that stuck out in spite of all the other stuff that was going on. He came to this one point where he was talking about his experience in South America, because apparently he's been traveling around a little bit. And he met someone who said to him, I wrote it down, "You're not very nice. It's kind of weird that you're not very nice." And that's how he told the story. He's like, people are always telling me you're not very nice, or something like that. And I remember hearing that and going, what? Like, that's weird. And he got kind of worked up and was like, well, let me tell you something. He's like, I've healed more sick than you. I've raised more dead than you. I can speak in tongues for longer than you. He's like, don't talk to me about being nice. And I was like, what? What is happening? Like, up until now, it's like, okay, all of this is fine. Like, I can deal with this. I'm personally uncomfortable, but all of this is making sense at least. There's a logic, there's a flow. And then we get to that, and he's like, people are always telling me I'm not very nice. And he's like, but it doesn't matter, I'm super powerful. I've raised more dead than you. I'm like, what is happening? What is that about? Let's imagine he's correct. Let's set aside all skepticism, and let's imagine that all of his claims are true. And he wanders around South America raising dead, healing sick, and speaking in tongues and prophesying. If you're a jerk, that doesn't matter. If people are always telling me I'm not very nice, what? That's crazy. That is crazy. Because if you can fathom all mysteries of the universe, if you can speak in tongues, if you can prophesy, if you can perform great acts of service and sell all you have and give it to the poor, and you don't have love, you are nothing. You are a resounding gong and a clanging cymbal. Frankly, both of those things are annoying. Cymbals are only nice when they're accompanied by drums, or a band. Nobody puts in their earbuds and gets on the treadmill and listens to cymbals. Or gongs, Awesome.
That wouldn't surprise me.
We learned last week that love is extremely active. Like every one of those things that was illustrated in those videos, which were really fun. I really appreciated those. I hope that you did too. The youth worked really hard to put those together. I just loved that. Got sidetracked by how excited I was about those. All of those things were actions, or maybe dispositions, or reactions. Like, it's about doing stuff. Right? You probably heard the love is a verb and all these other ways to talk about love. Like, love is about doing things. You are doing stuff when you are being loving or something like that. And so when we see things like in James, when James says, faith without works is dead, I wonder how much of a stretch it would be to say something like faith without love is dead. Right? If we know that love is about working toward making other people feel important, feel valued, feel respected, or whatever other ways we might describe that, if faith without works is dead, then maybe faith without love is dead also. And I think that this is a connection worth making when we're thinking about this love list, and we're looking at the characteristics that describe a loving person, and they all have to do with doing stuff. I don't think that James would be offended by that connection. It just seems obvious that as we're thinking about faith, faith in and of itself is not an end. It seems to be a means by which we get closer to being more loving, get closer to love, get closer to the example of Jesus. These faithful things that are listed, these expressions of faith or of power in faith, are only valuable insofar as they connect to how we love other people and how we love God. And if we don't have love, if everybody that we bump into describes us as not being very nice, there's probably a problem. And as it says at the end, we gain nothing in verse 3. So let's think about how love compares to hope. Picking back up in verse 4, Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. And obviously we covered this in great detail last week, and so I'm not going to do the whole thing again, but that last line, it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. I think all four of these characteristics correspond with hope. I would say very directly. If you're protecting someone, it's because you have a hope for their future that is being threatened by some particular danger. If you're trusting them, it's because you have the hope that they will not betray you. If you're persevering, it's because you are hoping that there will be an end to whatever thing you're going through is, whatever it is that you are going through. And of course, if you're hoping, you're hoping. And so I think all of these things are hope, and that love is bound up in hopefulness as well. But I think that hoping is simply a characteristic of love. It finds itself located in a list of things that really don't have anything to do with hope. Being patient and being kind. These are just dispositions that would describe a loving person that aren't necessarily categorized or characterized by hopefulness or hope. Hope is listed as one of the attributes that a loving person would display. And love as a principle can't be separated from hope, I think, which is why we find hope on the list at all. We don't always love because it's easy, natural, or convenient. We love because we're optimistic about outcomes. We're optimistic about the future. We hope that by loving people that they might come to know Jesus, that their relationships might be restored. We hope that by loving people we might become more like Christ. We might bring glory to God. Like we're always hoping for things while we are loving. But love extends beyond that hope. To just say love is hope would not be accurate. Love is hope, and love is also a bunch of other stuff. And so if faith without love is dead, and if hope is just a subset of love, it shouldn't surprise us at all to read what we read in the next section here, beginning in verse 8. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. And when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Now, by the time we get to the last line, reading through this chapter in particular, but also as a result of the whole series, we are not at all surprised to find that that is the conclusion of the matter. These three things are the most important things: faith, hope, and love. But the most important of the most important is love. I suspect none of you are surprised by that conclusion. But in order to get to that conclusion, we need to take a slight detour through this one phrase that I think may cause some confusion for some. I know it certainly did for me the first time I heard it. What does love never fails mean? I'm sure many of you have been in experiences, or have been in situations, or had experiences rather, where it has felt like love has failed. Maybe you might describe it as someone who was supposed to be loving you failed at loving you. Or you were loving someone and your love failed to bring about meaningful change in their life. And now maybe they're gone. Now maybe they're your enemy. And you might look at that situation and say, wow, man, love really failed. That was not effective. I want to validate that experience, so I'm moving so slowly through this portion. That's probably not your fault. I don't know the situation, but that's probably not your fault. I think love never fails means something different from that, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But Love never fails. Once or twice in my life I've heard it's been kind of wielded as a weapon. Like if you just can be the correct amount of loving, or if you can learn to be more loving, or something like that, then it won't fail, and then you will be a better evangelist, friend, father, mother, daughter, son, whatever, spouse. In an abusive relationship, if you just love them better, eventually they'll come around, because we know that love never fails. I think that is a lie sent to trap you and enslave you in situations that you should get out of, in abusive situations, and sent to make you feel like garbage. If we want to know what love never fails means, we have to see what the author said about love never failing. It's right here in the text. And if you just pull out love never fails and use it as a cudgel to beat yourself up over, or to beat someone else up with, we're missing the point of what's trying to be established here in the text. Love never fails at what? That's the question. Love never fails at what? And I think that we see that answered right in the passage following. Where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. Love never fails at enduring. What we've been talking about throughout all of chapter 13 is what things have eternal significance. If you don't have love, and you speak in tongues and prophesy, and all the examples from back in verses 1 through 3, that amounts to nothing. You gain nothing. Those things are temporal. They are temporary. We are in a situation now when we need them, and eventually the situation will be that we don't. Right in the text here, for now we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. So we're getting into some potentially technical, theological, jargony type stuff. So let me try and make this as simple as I know how to. Think of a baseball game. Baseball is a fairly universal sport, so I suspect that most of you have seen it or experienced it, even if you don't understand the rules, and that's okay. Now imagine you don't understand the rules to the baseball game, and you're sitting there and you're watching it. You would need someone to sit next to you and explain what is happening to you. Why did everyone on the field just walk off the field right then, and then everyone from the other team walked on the field? That was a weird thing, and they all knew to do it at the exact same time. Why did that happen? Like, oh, well, it's a change in innings. It's like, what do all these crazy words mean? Grounder, pitch, fly out, home run. What's a home plate? Like all of this stuff that you kind of take for granted after you've been exposed to it for a little while. A person who is new to the game would need explained to them. They would not all the time be able to just observe and figure out what's going on just by observing. Sometimes the batter swings at it, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes when the batter doesn't swing at it, everyone's happy. Sometimes when the batter does swing at it, everyone's upset. And sometimes you flip that around. How do I understand, what am I looking at here? There's so many things happening with these specific rules that I don't know and that I don't understand if I'm just an observer who doesn't know anything about baseball watching the game. It's weird. Everyone seems to know what they're doing, and it's all happening at once. And for large portions of the game, there's a guy way out there in the grass who just stands there and doesn't move. What's he doing? Why don't you come in here and help? Like you need someone to explain to you. It's like, oh, well, he's there just in case someone hits a ball out there. Well, why do they hit the ball out there? Oh, well, you hit the ball so that you can advance around the base. Well, why do you do that? So you can score runs. You need somebody to explain the rules. And you need someone to tell you what is happening. Let me try and connect this now. So a commentator, someone describing what is happening, is like prophecy. Throughout the Old Testament, people are describing what God is doing. People are, prophecies are being given like, go out and fight this nation because they're being judged, or don't fight this nation because they're not being judged, or go quietly into submission to Babylon because you are being judged. Right? The prophets are telling the people what is happening and what God is doing. And tongues seem to be used to explain the jargon, the baseball terms, all of the pitch, home run, third out, innings. Inning? What is an inning? Like, the tongues are used to explain that jargon. At Pentecost, like Eric talked about at the offering time, was the communication of the message across all languages so that people could understand it. Because there is a communication barrier that has been introduced after the Tower of Babel. That's something we've talked about before, and so I'm not going to deal with that now. Speaking in tongues is a way of overcoming the communication barrier so that you can understand the jargon, and I can say it's the third inning and you know exactly what I mean. And then knowledge is understanding what the rules are. Understanding why that pitch meant that guy went to first base, that pitch meant that he went back into the dugout. Understanding the rules is knowledge. And so as we are here in this baseball game of a world, trying to look out and observe what's happening and trying to figure out what is going on, it is really helpful when somebody comes along and prophesies to us and says, this is what is going on, this is what's happening right now. It's really helpful when a commentator explains it. It's really helpful when someone comes along and defines terms for us and explains jargon. What is a bunt? I thought that was a round cake with a hole in it. Right? It's really helpful when somebody explains that to us. And it's really helpful when somebody explains the rules. The future that we are imagining, the future situation that we are imagining, is that we all have perfect knowledge of baseball. No one is going to need to explain what's happening. No one is going to need to explain the rules. No one is going to need to explain the terms. We are going to completely understand every single aspect of the game, and we are going to be sitting right behind home plate watching every single action or event in the game and perfectly understanding it. Commentator would be worthless at that point. That would just be noise. You don't need someone to explain it, you understand it. And you are physically present to witness it. So, what he says, I'm going to try and connect this directly to the text. I hope that this baseball metaphor is helpful. For now we know in part, when completeness comes, what is in part will disappear. When I was a child, I talked like a child, and I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. The metaphor is, children don't understand baseball until someone explains it to them to the point where they do understand it. That's going to happen to us more directly. Right? Like when we meet Jesus face to face, we're going to have perfect knowledge of baseball. That's a weird quote. I hope that ends up on Facebook. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. It's kind of like we're watching the game on TV and we've got a commentator explaining what's happening to us. We can't see the trajectory of the ball very well from the weird aerial view that we have. So we need the commentator to explain what happened and why that guy was able to or was not able to catch the ball and how many runs were scored and all that kind of stuff. Because we can't see all of that. We're not present at the game, so to speak. We are looking through a darkly lit mirror and having trouble seeing the details. And he goes on to say, eventually the mirror is going to be gone and we're going to turn around and we're just going to look right at it and see everything clearly. And that's the metaphor. Now we know in part, but then we will know fully, just as we are fully known. The kind of knowledge that God has about baseball, you are also going to have about baseball. The person who understands the ins and outs of baseball better than anyone else that you know, who's been explaining the game to you for years and you just quite haven't gotten it yet, you are going to have knowledge like that person has knowledge. Intimate knowledge of the game and stats and terms and all of that stuff. So, conclusion, all of this other stuff, commentators, scorekeepers, all of this stuff is going to fade away because we will all perfectly understand. And love never fails. So love in the analogy is that completeness that we're talking about. That's why the definition of love is so broad. You noticed that yesterday. It encompasses all relationships. It encompasses all interactions. No one is excused. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Somebody famous said that, I think, once. It's Jesus. Right? Perfectly understanding the game, when we perfectly understand the game, love will be all that remains. Love never fails like these other things fail. These are temporary things that are only necessary until we understand baseball, and then they're not necessary anymore. These are things that are necessary until we understand the ways of God perfectly, until we understand living in community perfectly, until we understand living as a loving person perfectly, and then we will not need to be taught about these things anymore. There won't be any jargon. We'll all be perfectly speaking the same language. We're not going to be confused about what God might be doing behind the scenes. There are no scenes. We're just looking right at what God is doing and going, oh, that's what God is doing. Who needs prophecy at that point? We don't need divinely imparted knowledge in the form of scripture or otherwise anymore because we're just there, learning at the feet of God. Understanding all the stuff that before had to be explained to us. Love never fails because love will be all that's left at that moment. And we will be living in it perfectly. Love never fails because it endures. Where nothing else endures, love endures. There's even something about that. Love endures all things is one of our characteristics of love. Childhood analogy is also good. I want to talk about that for just a second because I just mentioned it and move on. The childhood analogy is also good because there are rules and things that you have in place as a child for you that help you understand appropriate boundaries in life that go away when you're an adult. Right? That's also why this is such a great analogy to talk about love enduring, but these other things not enduring. Like there comes a point in your life when you don't need your parent to tell you don't put your hand in the boiling water. That happens, or should. I sure hope that there's no 35-year-olds who are like, yeah, I didn't know it'd be hot, so I put my hand in, That's why the analogy makes sense, because the day will come when we understand these things implicitly. We don't need them to be explained to us anymore. So seeing through a mirror lit darkly is a lot like a child sees the world. They don't understand where the dangers are. They don't understand what things they can trip on, fall over, fall off, all those kinds of things. But eventually, they will. Eventually they grow up. Same with all of us. We are spiritual children who eventually, after the resurrection, will be mature. We'll be like spiritual adults. And we'll be able to understand stuff that we previously didn't understand. And no one's going to have to explain it to us through prophecy or tongues or divine knowledge. Does this make sense? Are you all convinced that love is the greatest of these?
Amen.
So what do you do with that? Right? Lots of theological jargon and concepts and a funny story about a crazy guy. What do we do with this? The greatest of these is love. This may seem simple and intuitive to you, but I'm just going to keep repeating this for as many years as I'm here. Love is the most important thing, period. Like love is what we are about as a people. Love is what you are supposed to be about as an individual. Love as defined by 1 Corinthians 13, that doesn't let anyone off the hook to be selfish, is what we are supposed to be about as human beings. The ideal human being is a perfectly loving human being, like Jesus. This connection needs to be obvious, it needs to be intuitive, and this needs to be boring when I'm telling you because you've heard it so many times. Right? We're growing up in an era when it's increasingly strange, I think, to talk about Christianity as love. Christianity is against things. This is what we know about our experience with people on TV or rude people at work who might get described as not very nice and who don't care because they can raise the dead. We are supposed to be a loving people, characterized by love all the time, not just on Sunday morning and not just writing checks to charitable organizations and stuff like that. Love. Love is it. It's love. Love endures. All this other stuff will pass away, and then love, and then love, and then more love, and love on top of love, after we love when we're loving the loving people who we love. Okay? It's love. It's love. And I believe in all of you. Right? This congregation is a loving place. I have been embraced lovingly here. My family has been embraced lovingly here. I've watched newcomers get embraced lovingly here. You all are doing a good job at this. And I love that about you. I love how you love. Let's keep loving. Let's keep getting better. Love more. Love wider. We can do this. Let's pray. God, the only thing on my mind right now is Jesus, his greatest commandments. Loving you and loving our neighbor. Help us to do that. It seems like such a simple thing to say out loud, but such a hard thing to practice. We need your help. We need you to show us how to do it better. And we anticipate the day when you won't have to show us anymore, and that we will see clearly, because there won't be a mirror in the way. And we're so grateful that you loved us first, and that everything we know about love is because of what you taught us. Help us to continue improving. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.